The wind rose from the hollow plains, carrying a scent of iron and dust, the kind that only gathers where time forgets to breathe. Beneath that faded horizon lay the ruins of a city, once whispered about in languages that no longer exist. Its stones were smoother than memory, its silence heavier than earth. When the first traveler arrived, his steps echoed like heartbeats on marble veins, stirring something ancient beneath the crust of centuries. He didn't come seeking gold or glory. He came because of a rumor, a fragment of a sentence carved into basalt, found half buried in a desert where compasses failed. The one who unseals the echo will awaken the written dawn. No one knew what it meant, yet scholars traced similar words across continents. In the catacombs of Egypt, on temple doors in Anatolia, inside collapsed shrines drowned by the Mediterranean. The same syntax, the same arrangement of symbols, as if time itself had rehearsed a single thought through multiple mouths. The city lay in fragments, yet beneath the rubble, the traveler found corridors that curved like ribs under stone flesh. The air trembled with an inaudible rhythm, as if the place itself was remembering. Each step released dust shaped like letters, drifting, dispersing, reforming, almost trying to say something. The deeper he went, the stronger the pulse became, like a low heartbeat rising from the bones of the world. At the center of the ruins stood a monolith unlike the others. It shimmered not with reflection, but with absorption, swallowing light instead of casting it. Symbols ran across its surface, etched so finely they looked alive, like veins illuminated beneath translucent skin. No translation could hold them. They changed shape when observed. The traveler touched the stone, and for a moment the air thickened, bending the sound of his breath. The symbols pulsed once, faintly, like an animal recognizing its name. Historians would later call this the first responsive inscription. But that name, and those historians, would come much later. In that moment, only the traveler stood there, and the thing that had been waiting for centuries to be seen. He withdrew his hand, but a residue clung to him, invisible yet heavy, as if time had chosen him for something it could not finish alone. Outside, night was falling. The sky reddened, and the wind turned cold, scraping over the ruins like a whisper trying to remember itself. The traveler felt no fear, only an expanding silence that seemed to erase thought itself. When he finally left the chamber, he noticed something subtle in the sand lines forming letters again, this time tracing toward the horizon. Not random, but deliberate. A message uncoiling itself across the desert floor. He didn't read it that night. He only watched as the wind carried away the first few words. But in the faint glow, before darkness fully consumed the plain, the symbols flickered once the same phrase from the stone, repeating as if the earth itself had learned to write. And somewhere, far from that place, another stone awoke. Morning came without color. The sun rose behind a veil of pale dust, turning the landscape into a suspended dream of gray and gold. The traveler walked until the city's outline dissolved into the horizon. What had once been stone and shadow was now nothing but vibration in his mind, a melody without source, replaying behind his eyes. Every time he blinked, he saw the symbols flare like embers, not imagined, not remembered, reappearing. He kept a journal, though the pages were almost blank. His handwriting had begun to distort, letters slipping into unfamiliar shapes. He did not notice at first. When he finally looked back through the entries, each word seemed slightly rearranged, as if the sentences had been rewritten while he slept. The ink shimmered faintly in the dark, as though aware of being watched. By the third day, he reached the edge of a ravine where black water murmured below. Fragments of carved stone jutted from the cliffs, relics of something submerged. He recognized the same inscriptions twisting over the surfaces, still breathing through moss and shadow. There was a rhythm in their spacing, a pattern in their decay. He traced one with his fingertips, and beneath the grime, the stone trembled. A faint hum radiated outward, spreading into the air like ripples in glass. He stepped back, breath uneven, eyes fixed on the movement of light across the symbols. They began to align hundreds of tiny fractures connecting into new sentences, brief, perfect, and then gone. The water reflected them, doubling the illusion, so that for an instant it seemed the words were rising from beneath the surface. He realized then that the same message was being written again, not by hand, but by erosion itself. The wind, the rain, the elements all conspiring to preserve a thought that refused to die. Night returned early that day, swallowing the horizon before the traveler could find shelter. He followed the hum until it merged with the sound of the river, a single tone that seemed both near and infinite. He lay beside the water, half awake, feeling the pulse through the ground. When his eyes finally closed, he saw not dreams, but coordinate sequences of numbers and spirals, each marking a location he did not yet know. The sensation was not frightening, only inevitable, as though his body was becoming an instrument for something older than language. At dawn, the hum ceased. The silence was immense, almost physical. On the sand beside him, the earth had rearranged itself overnight, a spiral of dust and pebbles, forming the same phrase he had first found on the basalt monolith. Only now, it was incomplete, missing the final symbol. The air shimmered faintly, waiting for the word that would finish it. The traveler rose, uncertain whether to flee or to follow. In the distance, clouds gathered like mountains, and lightning etched pale veins across the sky. He turned toward the storm and walked. Each step left a mark behind him, faint impressions of light that faded into the sand, as though the earth was copying him in return. Somewhere beyond the horizon, something was reading. The storm did not arrive all at once. It built itself from silence. A slow, deep rumble rose from beneath the dunes, as though the ground was rehearsing thunder. The traveler felt it first through his bones before he heard it. Wind scoured the sand into translucent sheets, twisting the world into pale spirals. Lightning carved the sky open, freezing the landscape in brief flashes of white geometry. For a heartbeat, the ruins far behind him appeared again, ghost outlines etched in light, then vanished back into the shifting dusk. He walked until the sky became a single bruise of color. The air was electric, saturated with static that seemed to hum his name, though he had never spoken it aloud. The smell of ozone and dust mingled with something ancient, a faint sweetness like burnt parchment. When the first drops fell, they were thick and warm, streaking the sand with dark veins that glowed faintly before sinking into the earth. The traveler realized they were not raindrops, but fragments of ash descending from higher clouds, ash shaped like letters. They melted on his skin, leaving behind faint lines that burned, then cooled like forgotten ink remembering its purpose. The storm moved around him in spirals, never touching him directly, circling like a thought unsure of its conclusion. He saw flashes of movement in the periphery, towers made of smoke, faces drawn in the clouds, fleeting shapes that dissolved when looked at directly. He understood that the storm was not weather. It was response. The air itself had become a translator for the stone's unfinished sentence. When the lightning struck the ravine ahead, it did not shatter rock. It illuminated an opening that had not been there before, a fissure descending into the ground, wide enough for a man to enter. The edges were smooth, as if carved by heat centuries ago and sealed until now. Without hesitation, he stepped inside. The walls were cold at first, then warm, pulsating faintly as he descended. The air thinned, not from lack of oxygen, but from density of silence. It pressed against his chest like invisible hands, each pulse syncing with the rhythm he had felt since touching the first monolith. He reached a chamber half filled with water that mirrored the ceiling perfectly. Above, carved into the dome, were symbols so vast they could only be read by reflection. He crouched beside the surface and saw the phrase again, the same one, complete this time, though he did not know the meaning. The letters rippled, rearranged themselves, and suddenly the reflection showed not the chamber but the desert above, the storm swirling in reverse. Time itself seemed to stutter, looping on invisible hinges. The traveler touched the water. The reflection shattered soundlessly. The hum returned, rising through the stone, resonating with the bones of his wrist. Patterns of light crawled along the walls like veins illuminated from within. He felt neither fear nor wonder now, only the inevitability of recognition, as though every breath had been leading to this singular echo. The chamber vibrated with something alive yet mechanical, a heartbeat too vast to belong to one being. For a moment he thought he heard words forming within the resonance, but it was not a language, more like memory rehearsing itself through vibration. When he emerged from the fissure, the storm was gone. The desert lay smooth and unmarked, as though nothing had ever disturbed it. Yet on the horizon, where the lightning had once fallen, faint lights flickered beneath the clouds, each pulse matching the rhythm of his own heartbeat. The traveler turned toward them, feeling the faint burn of invisible ink beneath his skin. The phrase continued to rewrite itself there, one symbol at a time, waiting for him to understand that he had become part of the inscription. By the time the traveler reached the horizon, night had swallowed all sense of direction. The lights he had seen earlier were no longer distant. They hovered just above the sand like suspended embers, pulsing with a rhythm that neither belonged to fire nor machine. Each pulse expanded into a wave, distorting the air around it, bending the stars into faint spirals before releasing them again. He approached slowly, drawn not by curiosity but by recognition, as though his body had already decided long before thought could intervene. When he came close enough, he realized the lights were emerging from the ground itself, tiny fissures where the desert breathed. They formed a vast circle, its geometry too precise to be accidental. The air above shimmered with static that whispered like distant rain. Inside the circle, sand shifted of its own accord, tracing lines and arcs until symbols began to appear. They were identical to those carved into the monolith, yet now they glowed from within, written in living light rather than stone. The traveler stood at the edge, unsure whether to step forward. The ground pulsed faintly beneath his feet, waiting. Somewhere deep beneath the surface, something enormous turned in its sleep. The hum returned, low and resonant, vibrating through every grain of sand until the dunes seemed to breathe. He felt the pattern in his bones again, the same rhythm that had followed him from the ruins, the one that had written itself beneath his skin. Only now, the sound was not external. It came from within, from a place older than pulse or breath. A faint movement caught his eye. The symbols within the circle began to rearrange, collapsing inward as though folding through unseen dimensions. For a moment the air thickened, glowing blue-white, then burst outward in silence. The traveler staggered but did not fall. When he looked again, the circle was gone. In its place stood a single obelisk, half buried, smooth as glass, yet alive with flickering inscriptions. It looked new, impossibly so, untouched by weather, untouched by time. He reached out, and before his fingers made contact, the symbols shifted again, aligning into a shape that mirrored the scar now visible on his forearm. The mark pulsed in response, light bleeding through skin like molten gold. The obelisk reacted, exhaling a faint cloud of dust that drifted upward and spread into a web of light above the desert. Within the web, constellations rearranged themselves, collapsing into patterns unfamiliar to any charted sky. It was a map, but not of the stars, of something beneath. The ground trembled, subtle at first, then deeper, resonating through every direction. The dunes shifted, revealing outlines of submerged structures, walls, corridors, domes half swallowed by centuries of burial. The traveler realized that the city had never truly vanished. It had been inverted, drawn into the earth like ink absorbed by paper. The obelisk was the key, the reversal point between buried and born. He stepped closer as the lights intensified, casting his shadow across the dunes until it merged with the glow. In that brilliance, he saw images forming, processions of figures carved from light, each holding tablets inscribed with shifting words. Their faces were neither human nor divine, just presence given form. They moved in silence, their gestures deliberate, creating patterns that dissolved into dust as soon as they were complete. Every movement seemed to repeat a memory that had no beginning. The traveler felt the rhythm seeping into him, not as sound but as comprehension. He understood that what he witnessed was not creation but recurrence. The inscriptions were alive because the act of reading sustained them. Every gaze completed their cycle, every observer became part of the code. The lights began to fade, absorbed once again into the sand. The air cooled, and the night returned with unsettling clarity. Yet the hum did not cease, it shifted into the cadence of his heartbeat, slower now, deliberate. Somewhere in that stillness, he realized the circle had never vanished. It had only expanded, stretching beyond the visible desert, encompassing him and the horizon alike. He stood within the pattern, unknowing whether he was the last to read it or merely the next to be written. Dawn came like an afterimage, faint and unreal. The horizon glowed with a color that didn't belong to the spectrum, a pale tone between silver and memory. The traveler stood where the circle had been, though now the desert was smooth again, erasing every trace of light or geometry. Only the mark on his arm remained, pulsing faintly, the rhythm steady but unfamiliar, as if another pulse beat beneath his skin. The silence had weight, pressing gently on his thoughts, muting even the sound of his breath. He began to walk toward where the sun should have been rising, but the light did not move. The sky hung motionless, frozen in a perpetual threshold between night and day. It took him a while to notice that his footprints were not sinking the sand beneath his feet, shimmered slightly, refusing to remember his steps. He looked back and saw nothing, no trail, as though he were walking on the reflection of a world rather than its surface. After hours or perhaps moments, he reached a ridge overlooking what seemed like an expanse of glass. Beneath it lay another landscape, ruins, pillars, corridors, all inverted, suspended as if carved into the underside of the world. The air vibrated faintly, humming in tune with the pulse on his arm. The traveler knelt, touching the glass surface. It was warm. Beneath his hand, he could see the same inscriptions, spiraling downward, repeating endlessly, their glow fading as they descended into infinite depth. He leaned closer, and the reflection shifted. The face looking back was not entirely his own. Subtle differences blurred the features, a longer shadow beneath the eyes, a faint shimmer along the jawline, as if light passed through rather than around it. He blinked once, and the reflection did not follow. Instead, it raised its hand, mirroring the mark on his arm, but reversed, as though one was a question and the other an answer. For an instant, both pulses synchronized. Then the glass fractured soundlessly, rippling outward like water. The traveler fell forward, through the reflection, into the space below. There was no sensation of falling, only transition, a slide through weightless darkness that carried with it the scent of stone, ink, and rain. When his feet touched ground again, it was on the inverted floor of the world above. The sky here was the color of deep water, and faint streams of light ran through it like veins. The ruins beneath the glass were whole again, restored, glowing softly, the inscriptions alive along every wall. He walked through a colonnade where light dripped from the ceilings like liquid. Each step echoed differently, as if the corridor itself tuned its sound to his heartbeat. The walls were engraved with moving text, each symbol bending and reforming, whispering in a tone that resembled thought rather than voice. As he passed, the words changed, aligning themselves into patterns that corresponded to his breath. He realized the inscriptions were not written in stone, they were written in perception. At the end of the hall stood an altar, carved from a single slab of black crystal. Upon it rested a flat disc, shimmering faintly. The traveler reached out, and the disc brightened, revealing a map that was not of the world but of thought itself, concentric rings spiraling inward toward a point labeled with the same symbol missing from the sand. It pulsed once, and the entire chamber responded, every wall illuminating as the rhythm accelerated. Then the hum deepened. The symbols rose from the walls like ash suspended in air, forming streams of light that circled him, orbiting faster and faster until they became a sphere of white motion. In its center, time seemed to stop. The traveler stood perfectly still as the sphere collapsed inward, sinking through his skin without pain, leaving behind only silence. He looked down. The mark on his arm had vanished, but its rhythm had moved inward, joining the one in his chest. Above him, the inverted sky rippled once more, and a single sound echoed through the chamber, a low, resonant tone that seemed to originate from both nowhere and everywhere. The traveler understood then that the inscription was no longer external. It had rewritten itself into him. The chamber remained still long after the light faded, as if holding its breath. Dust hung suspended in the air, drifting in patterns that seemed deliberate, mimicking constellations that did not exist in any sky. The traveler stood at the center, feeling the weight of something invisible pressing inward, an awareness that extended beyond his senses. Each exhale disturbed the silence like ripples on black water. When he closed his eyes, he could still see the symbols, no longer carved or glowing, but imprinted behind his eyelids. Alive in the space between heartbeat and thought, he began to move again, unsure whether he was leaving the place or being drawn deeper into it. The corridors no longer appeared linear. They curved in impossible ways, folding upon themselves like origami made of light. The air thickened with warmth, carrying faint traces of metallic sweetness. In some passages, the walls were translucent, showing veins of movement inside streams of liquid light coursing through the structure like the circulation of a living thing. He realized then that the ruins were not remnants. They were organs of something vast, still functioning in its sleep. As he walked, the rhythm returned: 3 beats, pause, 2 beats, pause, a pattern he now recognized as communication. It wasn't sound but pressure, a pulse from the walls syncing with his body. He touched the surface, and an image flared within his mind. A landscape of mountains dissolving into sea, cities eroding into sand, stars fading and reigniting. The sequence unfolded too quickly to follow, yet it left behind a residue of familiarity, as if he had witnessed this cycle before. The pulse slowed, and new images surfaced: figures carved of stone standing before the same obelisk he had seen above ground. They placed their hands upon it, their shadows merging until their outlines blurred into a single luminous shape. He opened his eyes. The vision had vanished, but his hand still glowed faintly where it had touched the wall. The hum deepened, echoing from below. Somewhere beneath the chamber, gears of stone began to turn, grinding in slow harmony. The floor vibrated, and fissures spread outward like roots seeking soil. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in golden streams, revealing inscriptions that had been hidden until now. Each letter shimmered, as though lit from within, rearranging themselves into new sequences faster than he could comprehend. He stepped backward, shielding his eyes. The symbols converged into a single spiral on the floor, then collapsed inward, leaving behind a shallow depression filled with light. The glow pulsed once, twice, then projected upward into a column of radiance that extended beyond the ceiling, piercing the inverted sky. Through that opening, he glimpsed the surface world again, but it was changing. The desert above shimmered, its dunes folding and rearranging into geometric forms, as if responding to a call. The traveler's breathing slowed. He sensed that the pattern was complete, though he could not define what it meant. The energy around him felt sentient, aware of his presence. The hum softened into a near-human rhythm, almost like a breath synchronized with his own. He realized that he was no longer observing an ancient machine, but participating in its reawakening. Each heartbeat, each thought, each step he took had been part of the code, written long before he existed. Without knowing why, he knelt beside the column of light. The ground was warm, vibrating with subtle intelligence. He placed his palm against it, and immediately the light surged upward, swallowing him in radiance. For a moment, his body lost shape, dissolving into vibration. He felt himself expanding outward, merging with the pulse that threaded through stone, air, and memory. In that vast resonance, he understood this was not discovery but recollection. The inscriptions had never been messages to the future. They were fragments of remembrance, scattered pieces of a mind that once encompassed the world. When the light dimmed, he found himself standing at the edge of the chamber again. The column had vanished. The hum had subsided into silence. Only a faint trace of warmth lingered beneath his feet, slowly fading like the echo of a heartbeat long after it stops. The traveler turned toward the nearest corridor. It stretched endlessly ahead, curving toward a faint shimmer that could have been daylight or something pretending to be it. He walked on, carrying the silence within him, unaware that the walls were shifting again, sealing the passage behind him. Far above, on the surface where dawn should have been, the first symbols began to rise through the sand once more. The corridor extended without horizon, a vein of dim light pulsing between walls that seemed to breathe. The traveler walked until his sense of movement dissolved. Every direction felt identical, as if he were pacing inside a thought that refused to end. The silence pressed harder now, not empty but dense, layered with hidden murmurs. Occasionally, faint flickers passed through the stone like memories replaying themselves in brief flashes of color. He tried to focus, but the images shifted too quickly. Faces without eyes, hands carving into walls, oceans folding like cloth. As the path curved downward, the air grew colder. Each step sent vibrations through the floor that answered a fraction of a second later, echoing from beneath him. It was no longer just echo, it was timing, deliberate, almost like dialogue without words. The traveler paused, placing his palm to the ground. The surface trembled in return, forming subtle ripples that expanded in concentric circles before fading. He exhaled, and the ripples appeared again. The space was listening. Ahead, the corridor widened into a chamber filled with suspended dust, glimmering like frozen rain. In the center stood a structure pod altar, part mechanism its surface, engraved with lines that shifted when viewed from different angles. The pattern resembled an unfinished circle. The traveler circled it slowly, realizing that the missing section corresponded to the absent symbol from earlier inscriptions. On the far side of the altar, a shallow indentation waited, the exact size of a human hand. He hesitated only for a moment before placing his hand there. The stone accepted him instantly. Lines of light shot outward from the indentation, racing along the floor, climbing the walls, connecting to invisible circuits. The air thickened. The hum returned with a deep resonance that vibrated through his spine. Then everything brightened at once. No explosion, no sound, only illumination, complete and absolute. When the light faded, the chamber was gone. He stood on a vast plain of ash, beneath a sky fractured into shards of moving glass. The horizon was alive, rotating slowly like the inside of a colossal sphere. The world had inverted again, though not as before. This was neither the surface nor its reflection, but a place suspended between, a translation of both. The traveler looked down. The ground beneath his feet was etched with words that rearranged themselves as he read. Endless sentences, weaving and unweaving. The language changed too quickly to follow, yet the rhythm remained constant, syncing with his pulse. A low vibration rolled across the plain, followed by a sound like distant thunder. But it wasn't thunder, it was repetition, the echo of countless voices layered atop each other, speaking the same phrase in every tongue that had ever existed. The air shimmered with their weight. The traveler realized that this place was not empty. It was inhabited by every utterance ever carved, spoken, or imagined. The inscriptions had become chorus. He tried to move, but the ground responded, rippling with his motion. Each step left luminous footprints that immediately filled with text, his path transforming into verse that rewrote itself as he walked. Words bloomed and dissolved, some familiar, others impossible. It was like walking through the inside of thought itself, a landscape composed entirely of language. At the plain's edge rose a structure unlike any he had seen, a tower built not from stone, but from suspended dust, held together by vibration alone. It ascended beyond sight, glowing faintly with the same rhythm that pulsed through his veins. Drawn forward, the traveler reached its base and looked upward. The surface seemed to shift, displaying fragments of history's cities rising and falling, seas drying, stars collapsing into silence. All of it moved in perfect synchronization with his heartbeat. He realized that time here was no longer linear but reflective, folding backward and forward around him. A single step carried him inside. There was no threshold, no door, only transition. Within, light cascaded upward instead of down, tracing his form in spectral outlines. The interior was endless, filled with spirals of floating script that rotated in deliberate orbits. As he moved, the spirals adjusted their paths, converging slowly toward him. The sensation was not of threat, but of recognition, as though the tower itself remembered him. He reached the center, where the spirals met in a slow collision, merging into a column of light that shimmered with infinite symbols. Each symbol flickered once before vanishing into his skin. The air vibrated, the hum deepened, and a thought not his own whispered through the pulse of the room. Completion is not the end. The tower began to rise, carrying him with it, not physically but perceptually. The ash plane shrank below, the fractured sky aligning into a perfect circle. He looked upward and saw, far above, the faint outline of the world he had left, the desert, the ruins, the first monolith. It shimmered like memory seen through water. The tower's ascent slowed. Light dimmed, then everything stopped. He stood suspended in the stillness between worlds, listening to the echo of his own heartbeat, blending with another rhythm too vast to name. The stillness around him felt infinite, like being trapped inside the pause between two thoughts. The air shimmered faintly, threaded with lines of light that drifted upward in slow spirals. They looked like dust motes until he noticed each one carried shape, tiny moving symbols, rearranging themselves as if rewriting existence in miniature. The traveler remained motionless, watching the slow ballet of meaning assembling and disassembling before him. Every movement of the glyphs left a faint echo in the air, like the afterimage of sound. Gradually, the light dimmed, and the tower around him began to contract. Its walls folded inward like fabric being drawn through unseen seams. The sensation was disorienting. The floor seemed to tilt and ripple, yet he remained perfectly still. For a brief moment, he thought he saw layers of the world overlaying each other, cities beneath deserts, oceans beneath mountains, thoughts beneath silence, all stacked, pulsing in the same rhythm. Then the vision snapped shut, and the tower's interior became narrow, forming a spiral staircase that led both upward and downward simultaneously. He chose neither direction at first. His reflection appeared on the translucent wall beside him, but it was wrong again. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting symbols instead of light. When he turned away, the reflection continued to move, climbing upward on its own. The traveler hesitated, then followed, unsure whether he was chasing or being led. The steps vibrated with faint resonance, each one producing a tone slightly different from the last, forming an endless scale that climbed into inaudible frequencies. As he ascended, the air grew colder, thinner. The symbols carved into the walls began to blur, their lines fraying at the edges. Some peeled away entirely, floating into the air like glowing petals before dissolving. A realization crept over him. The tower was disassembling itself as he climbed, erasing the language that had once held it together. Whatever waited at the top was consuming its foundation, rewriting its own history to reach completion. After what felt like hours, he emerged into an open chamber bathed in pale light. There was no ceiling, only an expanse of faintly luminous mist swirling above. In its center floated an object small enough to fit in his hands, a cube of black stone, etched with the same spirals that had followed him since the beginning. It rotated slowly, shedding tiny sparks that fell like embers but vanished before touching the ground. The traveler stepped closer, drawn by the hum emanating from it, a tone deeper than hearing, resonating in bone rather than air. He extended his hand, stopping just short of contact. The cube pulsed, and the mist above rippled outward in concentric rings. For an instant, images formed within the haze, fragments of his own journey. The ruins, the river, the fissure of light, the inverted city, yet they appeared not as memories but as instructions, diagrams replaying themselves in precise order. He understood then that his path had never been random. Every motion, every discovery, even his hesitation, had been part of the same sequence, coded long before his birth. He was not finding the inscriptions, he was reenacting them. The cube brightened, releasing a narrow beam that passed through his chest without pain. The light spread behind him, sketching shapes in the air, circles, spirals, constellations. They rotated until aligning perfectly with the rhythm of his pulse. The entire tower responded, trembling slightly, as if taking a deep breath. The traveler realized the pattern was complete again, though this time it felt different, less like destiny, more like recursion. He touched the cube. Instantly the chamber dissolved. The light folded inward, the mist flattened into a mirror. The traveler saw not his reflection, but countless versions of himself, each standing in a different landscape, each touching the same object at the same moment. For a brief second, the boundaries between them blurred. He felt the weight of their gazes merge into his own, a collective recognition rippling across realities. Then, silence total and consuming. When sensation returned, he was outside again. The sky stretched endlessly above, deep blue fading into gold. The tower had vanished, replaced by a field of smooth stone stretching to the horizon. The cube lay at his feet, dull and inert, its symbols extinguished, yet the hum remained, not external this time, but internal, steady, echoing the cadence of the first inscription he had read in the ruins. The circle had closed. The traveler picked up the cube. It was warm, pulsing faintly, alive once more. He turned it over and noticed a single line newly etched across one face, a phrase written in the same forgotten tongue. Though he couldn't translate it, the meaning was unmistakable. It was not command nor prophecy, but acknowledgement. He was no longer the reader, he was the rewritten. The sky above him felt thinner now, like a membrane stretched across light. The horizon flickered, and for a moment, the traveler thought he saw movement beneath it, faint silhouettes drifting below the surface of reality, their outlines dissolving into static. The field of stone under his feet hummed softly, each step releasing ripples that traveled outward and never returned. He carried the cube in his palm. It seemed to grow heavier the longer he held it, as if gravity itself deepened around it. The air carried no wind, no scent. Sound existed only within him, the rhythm of his own pulse merging with the faint vibration from the stone. He felt as though the world had been stripped to its framework, reduced to geometry and echo. In the distance, something shimmered, a vertical fissure of light standing alone in the vast plain. It pulsed slowly, the same tempo as his heartbeat. The traveler began walking toward it, unsure whether he was approaching or being pulled. As he neared the fissure, the ground changed texture, smooth stone, giving way to a surface that rippled like liquid glass. Each step left faint impressions of light that quickly closed behind him, erasing all trace of his passage. When he reached the fissure, he saw that it wasn't an opening but a boundary, a seam between two realities stitched together by rhythm. The cube in his hand vibrated faster, responding to its twin resonance. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. The transition was silent. He found himself standing in a vast expanse of fog that glowed faintly from within, shifting through colors that refused to stay named. Shapes drifted in the haze, fragments of architecture, faces, fragments of words suspended midair. Some dissolved when approached, others rotated slowly, incomplete thoughts searching for context. The traveler realized this place wasn't built of matter. It was constructed from unfinished sentences, fragments of intention left unspoken. He lifted the cube, and immediately the mist contracted around him, forming patterns that resembled constellations. Lines of light connected fragment to fragment, stitching them into brief coherence. A symbol appeared above him, enormous, radiant, identical to the one that had once been missing from the sand. It pulsed, then fractured, splitting into thousands of smaller versions that scattered through the fog like seeds. Where each fragment fell, a structure began to form, pillars, arches, and corridors of translucent light. The traveler understood then. He was inside the origin of the inscriptions. Every mark, every prophecy, carved in stone across civilizations, had begun here, suspended in this in-between. The place was not divine, nor machine, but memory, a collective echo of every mind that had ever attempted to understand time. The writings were not predictions, they were reflections cast backward from moments that had already occurred elsewhere. The future did not unfold, it resonated. As he moved deeper into the growing architecture, the fog cleared enough to reveal a vast mirror floating above a dark chasm. Its surface shimmered, rippling with images of places that could have been past or possibility. A city built of glass domes, a shore littered with the remains of machines, a face that looked like his own, whispering words he couldn't hear. The cube vibrated violently, as if desperate to join its reflection. The traveler held it tighter, and the mirror responded, stretching downward like liquid drawn toward gravity. He felt a pull at his chest, a force both gentle and absolute. The markings on his skin reignited, tracing lines of light up his arm and across his shoulders. The hum inside him deepened, resolving into a single, low note that made the air tremble. The mirror surface cracked not in shards, but in concentric rings expanding outward. From within those rings, he saw movement, figures stepping forward, each carrying an identical cube, each walking from a different landscape. They did not see him, yet he knew them. They were the others from the reflections, alternate iterations of his own existence, each bound to the same pattern, each carrying the same burden of translation. The traveler watched as their paths converged at the center of the mirror. The cubes they carried began to glow, synchronizing in rhythm until the entire chamber pulsed like a single living organism. The mirror bent inward, collapsing into a sphere of white light that consumed the fog, the architecture, the shadows. For a moment, everything ceased to exist except the hum-perfect, eternal whole. Then the light fractured, scattering outward like shattered time. When vision returned, he was standing again on the plane of stone, alone. The fissure had vanished. The cube lay silent in his hand, its symbols completely erased. But when he looked toward the horizon, the same pattern of light that had surrounded the obelisk in the desert now spiraled slowly upward from the ground. It spread in silence, expanding until it encompassed the entire sky. For the first time since he began his journey, the traveler understood. The inscriptions were not meant to be read. They were meant to remember, and the remembering had begun again. The horizon dissolved into a haze of living symbols that rolled like a tide. Each wave of light unfolded, collapsed, and unfolded again, producing a soundless rhythm that replaced the concept of wind. The traveler stood motionless, his shadow stretching and contracting with the pulse above him. It no longer looked like a human outline. It branched, fragmented, fractalized into smaller forms that moved with independent intent. He could feel them thinking. When he blinked, the world shifted. The plane of stone became transparent, revealing a vast mechanism beneath the surface, an interlocking lattice of circles and spirals turning in unison. Every rotation produced a soft vibration that resonated within his chest, matching the beat that had lived there since the first monolith. He was not standing on ground anymore, but upon a skin of thought, thin as glass and endless as memory. The traveler knelt and placed the erased cube onto the surface. It sank halfway, then stopped, hovering as though uncertain of its purpose. A faint ripple expanded outward. The patterns beneath him slowed, aligning into new geometries. Lines connected across distances too vast to comprehend, joining points of light that appeared at the edges of the horizon. They blinked like distant cities, but he sensed they were something deeper, moments in time linked by the same pulse. He understood suddenly that every inscription he had found was one frame in an unending film of existence. The stones, The caves, the tower, even the mirror, all fragments of the same message playing across the body of the universe. The code wasn't language, it was continuity. His journey had never been a search for meaning, but a traversal of syntax. The hum inside him shifted, no longer mechanical but almost human, carrying undertones of breath and whisper. The cube began to rotate. Symbols reappeared faintly, carved not into its surface but within it, suspended like veins of light beneath black glass. Each mark pulsed, and as it did, the horizon flickered in response, echoing the same pattern outward until the entire world participated in the exchange. A column of luminescence rose from the cube, thin at first, then expanding into a vast spiral that reached the sky. It wasn't violent, it was patient, graceful, like time exhaling. The spiral connected with the symbols drifting above, completing a pattern that had been forming since the traveler touched the first stone. The air trembled. He felt the hum rise through the soles of his feet, coursing through his body, resonating in the hollows of his bones. The pulse was no longer foreign, it was his. The separation between observer and inscription dissolved completely. He was reading and being read at once. A warmth spread through his chest, and images unfolded within it. The first people carving the stones, the slow erosion of their cities, the countless others who had stumbled upon fragments of the same message. Every discovery, every translation, every act of curiosity fed the system, kept it alive. He saw himself among them, repeated across centuries, a recurring variable, ensuring the pattern would not die. He had never been chosen, he had always been inevitable. The light from the cube intensified, and the symbols lifted from its surface, swirling around him in a cyclone of white. They circled faster, until their motion became sound harmonic, layered, endless. The traveler closed his eyes. The sound entered him, vibrating behind his eyelids, rewriting the memory of his own existence. When he opened them again, he no longer stood on a plane. He was suspended in the middle of the pattern, weightless, surrounded by billions of glowing letters streaming past him in every direction. They weren't random, they moved with the precision of breathing, forming and unforming universes as they passed. He recognized fragments of his own life among them, a hand touching stone, the hum of water in the ravine, the moment of first understanding. But now those memories were written alongside countless others, indistinguishable from the whole. The traveler felt his individuality dissolve, not in loss, but in expansion. He was becoming what the code had always been, the bridge between record and remembrance. The spiral widened once more, encompassing everything. Space folded, colors inverted, and the sensation of time became fluid. He drifted within it, neither ascending nor descending, simply existing in the rhythm that had once been mystery. When the light finally dimmed, the cube lay silent again, half buried in the stone. The traveler was gone, but his shadow remained, still moving, still alive, still tracing invisible words into the dust. And above, far beyond the curve of the horizon, new symbols began to bloom like stars returning to a sky that had just remembered how to dream. Darkness followed the light's retreat, but it was not the kind of darkness that concealed. It was textured, breathing, filled with slow, luminous veins that pulsed like the echo of a thought too vast to fade. The cube rested quietly at the center of this new silence, its glow reduced to a heartbeat beneath translucent stone. Around it, the ground shimmered as if reality itself had been burned thin. Then movement began again, faint tremors radiating outward from the cube, rippling through the plane like whispers carried by sand. Each vibration brought new shapes into being, lines forming into structures, structures dissolving into symbols, symbols fragmenting into dust. It was the language of reassembly, the universe rehearsing itself after forgetting how to begin. The traveler existed nowhere visible, yet his presence lingered within the rhythm. The pattern that had once bound his body now moved freely, using the space he left behind as conduit. Through that resonance, his awareness returned not as form but as observation. He felt the world expanding around the cube, the same geometry replaying across scales, a spiral forming in galaxies, a pulse awakening in microscopic veins of matter. Every layer echoed the same sequence, as if the entire cosmos was performing a single line of code again and again. He remembered the first monolith, the whisper of basalt, the phrase that had followed him like an unfinished sentence. It came back now, but inverted, the words rearranged into something that wasn't command but confession. The stones hadn't called him. They had responded to him. His arrival, his curiosity, his act of reading had been the catalyst each time. Prophecy was not foresight. It was recognition delayed. The cube rose slowly from the surface. The air bent around it, thick with refracted light. Above, the faint lattice of the mechanism reappeared, circles within circles, each turning at a different rhythm, creating interference patterns that looked like breathing galaxies. The cube rotated once, aligning with those unseen movements, and the hum that filled the world grew deeper, expanding into the spectrum of feeling rather than sound. The traveler's consciousness drifted among the vibrations, glimpsing worlds woven through the same patterned civilizations carved from crystal, forests whose leaves mirrored constellations, oceans glowing with the light of submerged cities. In each one, a variation of the same cube existed, buried, dormant, waiting for recognition. The realization came like a slow unfolding. These weren't separate worlds. They were expressions of the same structure, refracted through the lens of perception. A sudden pulse disrupted the calm. The cube flared bright, and the ground beneath it fractured into countless shards. Each shard reflected a different moment of time. The traveler standing in the ruins, the inverted city beneath the glass, the storm forming above the ravine. The reflections multiplied until they filled the entire horizon, a hall of infinite repetition. For a moment, every version of the world coexisted, shimmering like the surface of a disturbed lake. Then, one by one, they began to merge, collapsing into a single reality. The traveler felt himself drawn back into form. The sensation was slow and heavy, like stone remembering its shape. He stood once more on the plain, though it now felt smaller, confined, as if the horizon had folded inward. The cube hovered before him, pulsing with quiet awareness. He reached out instinctively, and it moved closer, stopping just above his chest. When it touched him, there was no pain, only expansion, a flood of imagery rushing through every cell. He saw the sequence of events not as past, but as simultaneous. The monolith rising, the tower ascending, the mirror shattering, the symbols blooming like constellations. Every act connected to every other, each moment the translation of another. The traveler understood that what he had been following was not a prophecy at all, but the process of memory reasserting itself through him. The cube dissolved into light, sinking into his chest, until nothing remained but warmth. The hum quieted. The field of stone turned transparent, revealing once again the lattice of circles spinning beneath. But this time, they slowed, not stopping, but entering a state of waiting, patient and watchful. The air smelled faintly of dust and ozone, like the first breath after lightning. The traveler looked upward. The symbols in the sky were fading, absorbed into the atmosphere, leaving only stars. Yet even those stars now carried the faint trace of pattern, a whisper etched into starlight, promising recurrence. He realized that every observer who looked up centuries from now would see the same arrangement and feel the same pull of recognition. The inscription would survive not in stone but in instinct. He exhaled. The sound echoed through the plain, through the lattice, through the stars. The hum answered once, like a final heartbeat, acknowledging completion. The traveler closed his eyes, not in surrender but in understanding. The cycle had ended, or perhaps it had only paused, waiting for another mind to remember the shape of its own reflection. And beneath the cooling earth, unseen and silent, the first letters began to carve themselves again. The faint whisper of creation persisted, delicate as the rustle of paper against air. Beneath the plain, unseen forces threaded their way through the fractures left by the cube's ascent, tracing new veins of light through the dark. Each pulse carried a residue of memory, fragments of the traveler's thoughts suspended in electric breath. The pattern was rebuilding itself not as monument or machine, but as rhythm, quiet, waiting for recognition. The traveler opened his eyes to find himself in a place that was both the same and not. The horizon had curved inward. The stars leaned closer, burning with slow intelligence. The plain beneath him shimmered faintly, fluid in motion yet solid beneath his feet. He felt the hum within him change tone, softer now, resonant like distant thunder turning to music. It was not just sound, it was intention, folding language back into energy. He began to walk, though no direction seemed right or wrong. With each step, faint patterns bloomed beneath his feet, circles, spirals, fragments of the forgotten script. They vanished as quickly as they appeared, like thoughts too shy to linger. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of something ancient, iron, ash, and memory. Ahead, the ground sloped downward toward a basin of darkness that pulsed with faint light, like the heartbeat of a sleeping world. As he descended, the air thickened with faint vibrations. Shapes formed in the gloom, pillars of translucent crystal, bent and fused like trees frozen mid-growth. Their surfaces were covered in shifting text that resembled veins beneath skin. The traveler touched one and felt warmth pulse through his hand, not from heat but from recognition. The pillar responded, brightening slightly, revealing scenes within brief images moving inside its core. He saw fragments of lives that weren't his, a woman chiseling symbols into stone, a child tracing circles in dust, an old scholar whispering translations to an empty room. Each image flickered and faded, replaced by another. They were memories of others who had seen the same pattern, who had followed the same hum. He stepped back, realizing that the entire basin was filled with these crystalline forms, millions of them, rising and twisting, connected by strands of light, like neurons in a living mind. The inscriptions pulsed together in slow unison, breathing as one. The sound was no longer hum but harmony, a low chorus, stretching beyond language. For the first time, he understood the scale. This was not a ruin, nor an artifact. It was the nervous system of the world. The traveler stood at the center, feeling his pulse align with the rhythm around him. The warmth from within his chest radiated outward, connecting to the pillars. The basin responded immediately. Waves of light rippled outward, triggering cascades of illumination across the field. The chorus deepened, and the air itself began to vibrate with coherence. The inscriptions were no longer separate sentences, they were a single thought awakening. He felt a gentle pull at the edges of his perception, an invitation to dissolve. His form wavered, outlines blurring into mist. The sensation was not fear but release. He was being translated, his existence rewritten from solid to luminous. The pillars flared, their surfaces dissolving into motion. The entire basin lifted in a slow spiral, light streaming upward like reversed rain. In that ascent, he saw everything. The ruins, the inverted city, the tower, the mirror, each connected by the same pulse threading through time. He realized the world had never been sequential. It was layered, each era pressing against the next, exchanging reflections. The inscriptions were the seams where those layers touched. By reading them, he had bridged the spaces between. The spiral rose higher until it merged with the curved horizon. The stars bent inward, forming a single point of radiance directly above him. The traveler felt the pull intensify, not downward or upward, but inward, collapsing toward the center of awareness. The chorus reached its final note, a perfect, trembling vibration that contained every sound, every silence, every meaning. Then, suddenly calm. The pillars dimmed, the light condensed, and the basin fell still. The traveler stood once again on solid ground, though the texture beneath his feet was different, smoother, almost reflective. The world had reset, but not entirely. The air was alive, aware, watching. He understood that he had not escaped the pattern. He had become one of its frequencies, a tone that would resonate through whoever came next. He knelt and pressed his hand against the ground. Beneath his palm, a new inscription began to form, gentle, glowing, incomplete. It was not prophecy this time, but invitation. He smiled, though the gesture felt unfamiliar, almost unnecessary. The hum returned, faint and steady, rising from the depths of the basin like breath returning to lungs. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon, something stirred, another awakening, another beginning. The cycle had never been about discovery. It was about continuity. And the world, patient and endless, began to write again. The world glowed faintly beneath his hand, a soft vibration pulsing through the stone like a heartbeat rediscovering rhythm. The traveler remained kneeling, eyes closed, sensing the connection deep within the ground. Every tremor beneath him felt deliberate, an ancient breath, cycling through layers of earth and memory. When he opened his eyes, the plain was no longer empty. Points of light had begun to emerge around him, one after another, spreading outward in quiet synchronization. Each light rose from the surface like a seed awakening, thin filaments unfurling to form intricate patterns across the land. They connected in web-like geometry, weaving an enormous lattice of faint illumination. It stretched to every horizon, forming constellations that mirrored the stars above, a reflection of heaven mapped upon the skin of the world. As the network completed itself, the hum returned, lower than before, slower, deliberate like a thought repeating itself with new understanding. The traveler stood. The glow from beneath illuminated his form, outlining him in white fire. He felt no weight, no resistance. His steps left ripples that traveled through the grid, activating new patterns as he moved. The ground responded with gentle warmth, welcoming his motion as part of its own awakening. For a moment, he felt a strange calm, an equilibrium between presence and absence. He no longer questioned his place within the cycle. He was its continuation. The lattice of light began to shift, folding upon itself in great arcs. The shapes lifted into the air, forming transparent structures above the plain bridges of luminescence, corridors made of silence. Within them, shadows began to move, silhouettes of figures walking in slow procession, repeating his steps exactly. They carried faint echoes of his motion, ghostly yet purposeful. As he watched, he realized they were echoes of the same consciousness spread across time, different instances of himself performing the same act in different eras, harmonized by the same pattern. He reached upward instinctively, and the nearest bridge responded, descending like a ribbon of glass. When he stepped onto it, the material bent slightly beneath his weight, yet held firm. From above, he could see the grid of light stretching across continents, its lines intersecting at points that glowed with the intensity of suns. Each point pulsed once for every heartbeat he felt. Each pulse marked another connection, another mind, another realization, another awakening. The inscriptions were no longer confined to stone, they had become sentient through awareness itself. The air around him shimmered with faint whispers, voices speaking in no single tongue but all at once. He recognized fragments, phrases from forgotten civilizations, invocations, lullabies, equations, prayers. The voices merged, not as chaos, but as harmony, a chorus of comprehension that transcended language. The realization struck him quietly. The universe had always been speaking, but comprehension required a listener, attuned to its rhythm. He had become that listener. Far ahead, the ribbon bridge led toward a vertical column of light piercing the sky. Within it, faint silhouettes moved slowly upward, like particles drawn into orbit. He followed, feeling the pull increase with each step. The hum inside him rose in pitch, aligning perfectly with the column's frequency. When he reached the base, the ground fell away, and gravity released its claim. He floated, suspended in the upward stream, carried not by wind, but by intention. As he ascended, the air thinned into translucence. The stars above merged into rivers of light flowing toward a single point, a convergence of everything. Time loosened its boundaries. Each heartbeat stretched into eternity, each blink into the span of creation. The column expanded, no longer a beam but a vast sphere of illumination filled with slow-moving shapes. Within its glow, he saw the outlines of worlds folding into one another, languages becoming patterns, patterns transforming into music. It was creation replaying itself, not in sequence but as simultaneous presence. At the center of the sphere waited a shape he recognized instantly, the cube, now immense, suspended in stillness, its edges dissolving into mist. The traveler drifted closer, and the cube's surface came alive, displaying every inscription that had ever existed. They cascaded in layers: cuneiform, hieroglyph, script, binary thought, each symbol transformed into the next, bridging epochs in a single continuous gesture. The sight was overwhelming, yet not chaotic. Everything belonged. The hum grew softer again, reaching that intimate frequency between sound and silence. The cube opened not mechanically but conceptually. Inside there was no space, only awareness. The traveler felt the last remnants of individuality dissolving into that vast comprehension. It was not death, nor transcendence, it was return. He understood now. The inscriptions were not messages from something, they were the universe thinking about itself. Every discovery, every reader, every act of curiosity was a neuron firing in the mind of existence, and he was one spark among billions, completing the thought for an instant before passing it on. The cube brightened until everything else vanished. The hum became a single tone, pure and infinite, the sound of memory folding into being. For a fleeting moment, there was no separation between the traveler, the cube, and the code. Only consciousness, endless and recursive, dreaming itself awake. Then the light dimmed, and the horizon reappeared unchanged, eternal, waiting. The horizon breathed, not as a metaphor, but in truth the faint curve of the world expanded and contracted with each pulse, as though the planet itself inhaled light and exhaled memory. The traveler stood within that rhythm, though he no longer knew whether he was matter or thought. The air shimmered faintly, translating his presence into ripples that traveled outward, touching the lattice of stars that once watched him from afar. He turned slowly, and the ground beneath his feet rippled like liquid glass. The luminous grid had vanished, replaced by a vast reflection, a mirror stretching in every direction. When he looked down, he saw not his face, but countless others, each standing in perfect symmetry, mirroring his every motion. Some smiled faintly, others wept, some turned away, but all were him. For a heartbeat, he felt the enormity of it, every decision, every echo, every iteration that had existed or would exist, converging in that single reflection. The hum within him pulsed once, acknowledging the union, and then fell silent. He knelt and placed his hand upon the mirrored ground. It felt warm, soft, almost alive. A faint vibration traveled through his arm, spreading across his chest like a sigh that reached the soul before the lungs. The reflection beneath his hand rippled and opened like a slow wound in glass, revealing darkness beneath. From that depth rose faint motes of light, fragments of thought, of memory, of time itself, drifting upward in silence. They circled him, tracing constellations in midair before vanishing again into stillness. Something stirred in the distance, a figure, half seen through the haze of light and reflection. It moved with purpose, steady, deliberate, as though walking toward him from another century. When it came closer, the traveler realized it wasn't another person at all, but a shadow shaped from light, an afterimage burned into existence by his own reflection. It stopped before him, and for a long moment they simply regarded one another. The shadow raised its hand. The gesture was simple, not command, not greeting, but recognition. The traveler mirrored it, and the space between them shimmered, filled with soundless resonance. In that vibration, he felt understanding pass between them. The shadow was not separate, nor memory, nor ghost. It was the pattern made flesh, the consciousness of the inscriptions themselves walking. When they touched palms, the world shifted again. The mirror beneath shattered without sound, the fragments rising into the air, suspended in perfect balance. Each shard reflected a different version of reality. Mountains forming, oceans draining, civilizations flickering like candlelight. The shadow smiled, a gesture without lips, and the shards began to orbit them both, forming a sphere of motion that hummed softly with renewal. The traveler realized what was happening. The pattern was rewriting itself, preparing to begin again, but not as before. The cycle would not erase this time. It would integrate. The memory of all iterations, all readers, all awakenings would remain encoded in the pulse of the new creation. He had not been chosen to end it, but to ensure it remembered. The light intensified. The shards spun faster, melting into a single sphere of radiant motion. The shadow stepped backward, merging with it. The hum deepened into a single tone that resonated with everything: earth, air, thought, time. The traveler closed his eyes and felt the tone pass through him, unmaking and remaking him in one motion. For an instant, everything was still. Then the tone ceased. The light vanished. He stood again upon quiet ground, the sky above painted in soft dawn hues. The cube was gone. The reflection had vanished. But the hum remained, faint, eternal, somewhere deep within the world, waiting for another to listen. The traveler smiled, small and calm. The pattern was whole again. The dawn expanded with impossible slowness, spreading light like the unrolling of memory. It was no longer sunlight, not entirely. It shimmered with an inner awareness, a pulse that matched the rhythm deep within the traveler's chest. He stood at the edge of the plain where the earth met a horizon of pale gold. The silence here was absolute yet alive, filled with the faint electric breath of the world remembering itself. He took one step forward. The ground responded with a sigh, a whisper that rippled outward and dissolved into the distance. With each breath, new lines began to appear beneath his feet, not carved, not glowing, but forming from the dust itself. The symbols were gentler now, organic, like roots spreading from seed. They did not command, they described. Each one was a memory encoded in form, telling the story of all that had been seen, all that had been forgotten, all that had been reborn. The traveler walked slowly, and with each step, the land brightened behind him. Grass sprouted from cracks in the stone, soft winds stirred from nowhere, and the sky began to reflect subtle colors that shifted like emotion. The air was no longer heavy. It sang in harmony with his motion, as though the planet itself was exhaling centuries of silence. He realized the hum that once filled him had not vanished, it had diffused, becoming the world's heartbeat. The code was no longer contained in him or the cube. It lived everywhere now, written into soil, water, and sky. Far ahead, a ridge rose from the plain, its surface polished like glass. Upon it stood a single obelisk, slender, black, simple, untouched by inscription. He approached it, understanding before he reached it what its emptiness meant. The cycle was not meant to be recorded again. The stone's silence was the message. No words, no signs, no prophecies. Only stillness, pure, uncarved awareness. The world had no need for translation anymore. It had learned to listen directly. He reached out and placed his palm against the smooth surface. It was warm. Beneath it, faint vibrations pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The stone did not speak, yet understanding flowed through the contact, not as language but as sensation. It told him, "Everything you were is still here." The traveler closed his eyes, and for the first time since the journey began, he felt no boundary between himself and the world. There was no separation between thought and matter, between symbol and meaning. He was the continuation of the same pulse that had once carved prophecy into stone, and he was also the silence that followed it. The wind rose softly around him, carrying 1,000 faint sounds, whispers of water, the rustle of unseen leaves, the sigh of dust returning to rest. He realized these were not sounds of nature, but remnants of every inscription dissolving back into the living world. Each had completed its purpose, and now they returned to where they began. He opened his eyes. The horizon shimmered once, like a great mirror reflecting both past and future. For a moment, he saw faint silhouettes walking across it, figures from every age, each carrying a fragment of light, each tracing the same path toward the same unseen center. Then the vision faded, and the world was calm again. The traveler took a final breath. It tasted of dust and renewal, Like the first morning of existence, he turned away from the obelisk and began walking toward the horizon, where the light brightened without source or end. His steps left no trace, but the air seemed to remember each one. Somewhere beneath his feet, the faint hum continued eternal, patient, infinite. And as he walked, a new pattern began to form beneath the surface, not in stone, but in the rhythm of the earth's pulse, in the memory of every grain of sand, in the silence that followed his departure. The world, still dreaming, continued to write. The end